What a crazy way to live. This set of scripture readings set up for us what seems like a really kind of a crazy way to live, doesn't it? If you turn off your Sunday morning piety and you turn on your common sense and you think about the world that you live in when you leave this building tomorrow morning, for example, out in the real world where we live and work and go to school, out in the real world where we do the business of our living, is it really realistic to try to live in the way today's scriptures describe? And even if we could, even if it were possible, would anybody in their right mind try it? I suppose if you're having a tough time, if you're having a kind of a life where a lot of things have gone badly for you, you might turn to today's text to help you tolerate your plight. But the reality is there is nothing good about being poor. Nobody wants the circumstances that make us mourn. The struggle for justice and righteousness and peace is pretty much an exercise in futility, and humility is hardly the way to get ahead. As I was reading from 1 Corinthians this morning, I was thinking, if St. Paul had stopped earlier, if he had just simply said that this message about the cross is foolishness, and if he had stopped right there, it all would have made good sense. He looked around at that motley crew called the church in Corinth, and he saw what was obvious. There were not many wise. There were not many powerful. There were not many noble, because there's nothing about this foolishness that would attract the wise and the powerful and the noble. The church was, and he could see it with his own eyes, the low and the despised and the nobodies, the folk who embraced this foolishness. Blessed are the poor, Jesus said, and the meek, and those who mourn, and the hungry. And Jesus said it clearly meaning something good by it, because you know what the opposite of blessing is. The opposite of blessed is cursed, which is usually how we perceive being poor and being hungry and being grieving. Cursed are the poor is what we would say, or if we were trying to be politically correct, we would say, cursed is the condition that creates the poverty. Cursed is the circumstances that make it that way. Because you don't want to be poor and I don't want to be poor, never mind what Jesus said about it. Ben Franklin maybe is a little bit closer to the truth. Early to bed and early to rise, and I'll be happy to do it if Ben Franklin will guarantee the result, and you know the result. Early to bed, early to rise makes one healthy and wealthy and wise. And that's the blessed life, isn't it? That's the good life. That's the payoff for doing what you're supposed to do. That's the reason why we get up in the morning and get ourselves going, so that we can walk tall, so that we can be honored and respected, because we all want to be maybe godlike. And we know what it takes. And we will pay our dues. We will bring the burnt offerings, and we'll bring the year-old calves. We'll bring the rivers of oil. We'll bring the fruit of our bodies. We'll pay our dues. But we expect then to get our due. Isn't that the point? Maybe so, at least up to a point. Remember how it went, though, the first time we human beings decided we would be like God? We didn't read that text this morning, but do you hear the echo of a story that you probably know pretty well? The story from Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent came up to Eve and explained to her what she could have seen with her own eyes, how beautiful the fruit was on that tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the one tree that God said, you stay away from that one. But she looked and she saw, and sure enough it was good, that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And knowledge became for her a curse, not a blessing. Maybe like God is not the way you and I were created to live. Maybe like God is not how we were ordered and put together. Maybe somehow walking humbly with our God is how we were created. Maybe walking humbly with our God is the way of life that ought to be ours. But it's an awful hard track to stay on. It's an awfully hard track to stay on. It's a hard track because we get confused. We get confused so easily We get to the middle of the journey and we think we have reached the end of the journey, that somehow the middle is the blessing and we ignore the end. For example, we have a legitimate need, you and I, to make sure that our families are properly provided for. We have a legitimate need, you and I, to make sure that we do what we are able to do to earn the money that we need so that we can have food and shelter and all of that. That is a legitimate need, a legitimate concern, and you and I are involved in that process of seeing to it that we have what we need. But very often, and you have seen it happen, and maybe you've sensed it in your own soul, we get to the point where we're able to meet the needs. We have grocery money, we have a roof over our head, we got some clothes, we have the stuff that we need more or less. And what happens to our need for God? If I have managed to preserve my family from poverty, if I have managed to protect them from some sort of unjust treatment, if I have managed to take care of them at least tolerably well, what need is there for salvation? And then something happens, and we discover how fragile our circumstances are, and how quickly and how easily we can lose what we have. And then we realize that maybe we aren't quite like God anymore. And we begin to learn that even day by day, as we take care of ourselves and provide for ourselves, walking humbly with our God is the way to go. Because the blessing in life, turns out, is not the wealth and the happiness and the wisdom. And the curse in life, it turns out, is not the sickness or the poverty. The good things that we enjoy are not the things that bring us salvation, and the bad things that we detest are not always the things that bring us damnation. Eventually we begin to see it. What matters in joy and in sorrow, what matters in sickness and in health, what matters in plenty and in want is a relationship with Jesus. The relationship that develops as we walk humbly day by day with our God. Let me try to sneak up on it with a story that really does come at it from kind of a roundabout way. Way back when, I had a piano student named Mike. Mike was in elementary school at the time, just a little guy, probably 4th grade, 5th grade, thereabouts. I taught him for a couple of years. His mom and I were good friends, and so that's how I came to teach Mike. His mom and I were musical partners. We did piano 4 hands and 2 piano stuff, so we did a lot of music together, his mom and I. And you know how it is when mom tries to give a kid piano lessons, and Mike was at the age when that was not going so well. And so Linda said to me, would you give Mike piano lessons for a while? And so I did. And for several years, a couple of years, I taught Mike some of the basics of what it means to be a piano player. And then Mike started to pick up on this thing, and he moved on to better teachers, and I moved to another pastorate. But I always kept in touch with his mom because his mom was my friend, and so I always had some idea what was going on with Mike and what he was doing and where he was headed. About 6 months ago, I stumbled across Mike again as a young adult, and so now Mike and I are friends in an adult way. Mike went on to college, music major, piano major, and has become a real musician. Right now, at this very moment, Mike is probably finishing up worship in a big Lutheran church in Chicago suburb, up in one of the north suburbs, where he is the lead musician, responsible for their choirs and responsible for much of their music. And besides that, he also does a lot of accompanying and some teaching and so on in Chicago. So Mike is a busy performing musician, a real musician. He does what musicians do. He practices, he performs, and now he's also begun to teach. Mike has a piano student, a young fellow who's beginning to get the hang of it pretty good and starting to compete in some of those settings that would get him noticed and maybe help his student get on down the road to the next step. There is a sort of a process of competing that's a little bit like American Idol for classical musicians, a kind of a process like that, and the student is beginning to get involved in some of that. And so now the stakes are kind of getting a little higher, and the student is beginning to discover what musicians sooner or later discover when the stakes start to go up. That thing called stage fright. Anybody here ever experienced it? It isn't just musicians that experience stage fright. Actors and athletes and all sorts of people who have to get out there and perform discover this thing called stage fright. And Mike's student has been asking Mike, because he has seen Mike perform, why is it that you don't get nervous? How do you cope with stage fright? And Mike's answer to his student was dead on right. Sooner or later, everybody who succeeds as a performer learns this answer. Whether you're a piano player or a preacher, it's the same game. Performance is part of the game. You aren't really a piano player unless you go out there and play. That's part of what it means to be a piano player. And stage fright is just part of the deal. That fear of failure, that fear of going out there and making a fool of yourself, everybody faces it. Nobody escapes it. Stage fright is just part of the deal. So how do you survive it? How do you get over it? What Mike told his up-and-coming student and what my teacher told me way back when maybe will help us understand how to make some sense out of these texts that we have heard. Mike told his student, you go out there and you play because if you don't go out there and play, you're not really a piano player. But when you go out there and play, you go out there because the music needs to be played. You go out there to play because the music needs to be played. It has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with your success. It has nothing to do with your failure. It has nothing to do with whether the people cheer or boo or clap or what they do at the end of it. You go out there and you play because the music needs to be played, and if you don't go out there and play it, the music won't be played. You're a piano player, and that's what piano players do, because the music matters. The music matters more than you matter. The music matters more than your stage fright. The music matters more than your success. The music matters more than your failure. The music is what matters, and when you finally understand that deep down in your gut, you won't be so afraid. In the same way, when you understand what matters, it cuts through a lot of this foolishness. When we understand what matters, we see how this way of life makes some sense. When we understand what really matters, we see how this relationship with Jesus is what forms us. When we understand what matters, we see how that relationship begins to shape and to form every other relationship. And we begin to discover that the blessing comes from the relationship. It doesn't come from the wealth, it doesn't come from the wisdom, it doesn't come from the health. And we begin to understand that the curse comes from the collapse of the relationship, not from the weakness, not from the poverty, not from the folly. The music makes the musician's life, and our relationship with God is the source of our life. And in that relationship with God, we begin to enter the realm where Christ reigns. In the relationship with God, we find ourselves comforted. In the relationship with God, we find ourselves fulfilled. In the relationship with God, we discover mercy and grace. In the relationship with God, we become God's children. Rejoice in this, Jesus said. Be glad in this, because in this relationship, you will find your reward. And maybe that's not as crazy as it sounds. Maybe it's not as crazy as it sounds.